The lunch was meant to be routine, the kind of gathering that blended habit with obligation rather than anticipation. Nothing about the setting suggested that it would become a defining moment. The table was familiar, the conversation light at first, and the atmosphere controlled in the way my family always preferred. Control had never been loud or aggressive in our household. It appeared as calm, structure, and certainty. It lived in expectations that were rarely questioned, and in decisions that were framed as already settled. That afternoon, control crossed an invisible line and revealed itself not as guidance, but as a threat. The shift happened quietly. There was no shouting, no sudden explosion of emotion. My sister spoke with confidence, announcing a decision that affected shared assets, as though consensus had already been reached. Her tone assumed agreement, not because agreement had been earned, but because it had always been assumed. When I asked questions, they were not emotional or confrontational. They were practical, grounded in responsibility and long-term impact. Yet the act of questioning itself disrupted the balance my family relied on. The moment I refused to simply accept the decision, the unspoken rules became visible. My father stepped in quickly, not to moderate the discussion, but to end it. His voice was calm, almost rehearsed, carrying the authority that had shaped our family dynamics for years. He did not address the substance of my concerns. Instead, he reframed the situation as a matter of respect and loyalty. The conversation stopped being about the property and became about my role within the family. Control tightened, not through anger, but through finality. When he presented the ultimatum, it was delivered with the same tone one might use to state a fact rather than a punishment. The threat itself was simple and devastating in its clarity. Apologize or lose financial standing. There was no negotiation, no acknowledgement that disagreement could exist without disobedience. The expectation was compliance, and the consequence for refusing it was explicit. What made the moment unbearable was not the threat alone, but how normal it seemed to everyone else at the table. No one objected. No one questioned whether the demand was fair or proportionate. Their silence confirmed that this method of control had been accepted long before it was spoken aloud. In that moment, the illusion of choice disappeared. The demand was not about repairing a relationship or resolving conflict. It was about reinforcing hierarchy. The apology being demanded was not meant to heal anything. It was meant to signal submission. I understood then that compliance had always been the currency of peace in my family. Harmony was preserved not by addressing problems, but by ensuring that certain voices remained quiet. That lunch stripped away the final layer of denial and exposed the system exactly as it was. When I agreed without argument, it was not surrender in the way they understood it. The single word I spoke carried the weight of recognition rather than defeat. Control had revealed itself fully, and once seen clearly, it could not be unseen. The rest of the meal passed in silence, but the decision had already been made. Not just theirs, but mine. The threat had achieved its immediate purpose, but it had also destroyed the foundation it relied on. What followed after the lunch was inevitable. The calm certainty that had defined my family now felt hollow. The threat had transformed the relationship from one built on implied obligation into one enforced through consequence. That distinction mattered. It marked the point where influence became coercion, and where authority abandoned trust entirely. The lunch was not the beginning of the conflict. It was the moment control stopped pretending to be care. Looking back, the significance of that afternoon lies not in what was said, but in what was revealed. A system that depends on silence cannot survive clarity. Once control turns into a threat, it loses its power to disguise itself as protection. That lunch did not break the family in a dramatic sense. It simply exposed the fractures that had always existed, making it impossible to return to the comfort of not seeing them. Silence had always been treated as a virtue in my family, not as an absence of voice, but as proof of maturity. From an early age, I learned that restraint was praised more than honesty, and that maintaining peace mattered more than addressing imbalance. Speaking up was rarely encouraged, unless it aligned with what had already been decided. Over time, silence stopped feeling like a choice and became an expectation. It was framed as consideration, as emotional intelligence, as loyalty. What was never acknowledged was how consistently that silence was required from the same person. Favoritism did not announce itself openly. It existed in small, almost unnoticeable patterns that were easy to excuse when viewed individually. My sister's mistakes were softened by explanations before consequences could form. Her decisions were trusted by default, while mine were examined, questioned, or delayed. When conflict arose, concern gathered around her quickly, while I was asked to be patient, understanding, and flexible. The imbalance was subtle enough to deny and constant enough to shape behavior. No one labeled it favoritism, yet its effects were unmistakable. Compliance became the unspoken cost of belonging. Each time I stayed quiet to preserve calm, the expectation strengthened. Each compromise taught the family that resolution could be achieved without addressing the underlying issue. I was not pressured through force or anger, but through reassurance and moral framing. I was told I was being reasonable, that I was helping, that I was the bigger person. The praise felt affirming in the moment, but it came with a quiet erasure of my own needs. Over time, compliance stopped feeling like generosity and started feeling like self-neglect. Silence was rewarded because it made things easier for everyone else. It prevented discomfort, avoided confrontation, and allowed decisions to move forward without friction. Yet the relief it created was temporary and one-sided. Problems were never resolved, only postponed, and the burden of that postponement always fell on me. I absorbed the tension so others would not have to feel it. The cost was not immediate, but it accumulated slowly, turning into resentment I was never allowed to express. Favoritism shaped outcomes long before conflicts reached the surface. Decisions were made with assumptions about who would adjust and who would be accommodated. When my sister acted decisively, it was seen as confidence. When I asked for clarity, it was framed as hesitation. The same behavior carried different meanings depending on who displayed it. Over time, this double standard created a hierarchy where authority flowed in one direction and accountability in another. Challenging it was treated not as a search for fairness, but as disruption. The cost of compliance became clear only when I stopped paying it. The moment I resisted the expectation to smooth things over, the system reacted. Silence, once praised, was suddenly unacceptable. Compliance, once assumed, was demanded. What had been presented as voluntary was revealed as conditional. The peace I had helped maintain was never mutual. It depended on my willingness to accept less voice, less protection, and fewer options. In recognizing this, something shifted internally. I saw that silence had never protected me. It had only delayed confrontation while reinforcing imbalance. Favoritism had not been accidental, and compliance had not been neutral. They were mechanisms that kept authority intact and accountability distant. The cost was not just emotional exhaustion, but the gradual loss of self-trust. Each time I stayed quiet, I learned to doubt my own perspective. Breaking that pattern did not restore harmony, but it restored clarity. Silence no longer felt like strength, and compliance no longer felt like virtue. What remained was an understanding that fairness cannot survive where favoritism goes unchallenged. And peace built on one person's silence is not peace at all. The word itself was unremarkable. It carried no emotion, no argument, and no visible resistance. Spoken softly and without emphasis, it blended into the moment as if it were simply another act of compliance. Yet that single word shifted everything. It was not chosen to provoke or challenge, but it marked the point where pressure met clarity. In that instant, the dynamic that had governed my family for years began to unravel, not through confrontation, but through consequence. When I said it, the assumption at the table was that the matter had been resolved. Authority had been asserted, compliance had been delivered, and the system had functioned exactly as intended. There was no sense of alarm or hesitation. The calm that followed was interpreted as victory. No one considered that agreement, given under threat, might carry implications beyond obedience. The word was received as surrender when, in reality, it was acknowledgement. I was no longer negotiating within their framework. I was stepping outside of it. What made that word powerful was not its meaning, but its timing. It came after an ultimatum that transformed a family disagreement into an act of enforcement. By responding without resistance, I removed the emotional fuel they expected to manage. There was no argument to counter, no justification to dismiss, no reaction to control. The machinery of authority moved forward on its own momentum, unchallenged and unchecked. In doing so, it crossed a boundary that could not be walked back. The reckoning began quietly. Without warning, actions were taken quickly, assumed to be valid simply because they had always been before. Papers were filed, decisions executed, and control exercised with confidence that no obstacle existed. The belief was that power, once asserted, would secure the outcome. What was overlooked was the structure beneath that power, the legal framework designed to withstand precisely this kind of overreach. The word I spoke did not trigger the reckoning by intent, but by allowing authority to reveal itself fully. The legal consequences that followed were not driven by emotion or retaliation. They emerged from documented actions taken under the assumption of unchecked control. The attempt to enforce compliance exposed a misunderstanding that had existed for years. Authority within a family does not override binding agreements. Emotional justification does not substitute for legal permission. Once the process began, it moved forward independent of anyone's feelings or explanations. What struck me most during this unfolding was the contrast between expectation and reality. The family believed that compliance would restore order and end discomfort. Instead, it set in motion a process that stripped away the very authority they relied on. The system they thought they controlled responded not to intent, but to evidence. Words spoken at a table mattered less than actions recorded in documents. The reckoning was not personal. It was procedural. That single word created space. Not space for reconciliation, but for truth. Without resistance to absorb the pressure, it redirected itself inward, exposing weaknesses that had been hidden by habit and assumption. The legal structure, long treated as background noise, became the central force. It did not ask who was right or wrong emotionally. It asked who had the authority to act, and whether that authority had been respected. As the consequences unfolded, it became clear that the reckoning was irreversible. Once authority crossed into violation, the outcome no longer depended on dialogue or apology. The process did not pause for reflection or regret. It continued because it was designed to do so. The word I spoke did not cause the breach. It simply removed the illusion that obedience could prevent it. In the end, the power of that word lay in what it refused to do. It did not argue. It did not defend. It did not attempt to preserve a system that relied on silence to function. By accepting the ultimatum as stated, I allowed the truth of the situation to surface without interference. The reckoning that followed was not dramatic, but it was absolute. One word was enough to let the law speak where I no longer needed to. No one around that table believed the trust clause was anything more than a formality. It had been drafted years earlier, buried among pages of polite legal language, activated only under circumstances everyone assumed would never arise. It existed as a precaution, a quiet safeguard meant to protect balance if harmony ever failed. Because harmony was assumed, the clause became invisible. It was never discussed seriously, never explained in full, and certainly never respected. To those who benefited from control, it was an inconvenience best ignored, a technicality that could be overridden by influence, pressure, or silence. For years, decisions were made as if authority was permanent and unquestionable. The trust was treated like a personal extension of power, rather than a structure designed to outlast individuals. Meetings were performative, signatures expected rather than requested, and dissent interpreted as disloyalty. The clause that required transparency and independent review in the event of coercion was quietly sidelined, its presence acknowledged only by the lawyer who had insisted on it and the person it was meant to protect. Everyone else behaved as though it did not exist. The shift happened slowly. Then all at once, What had once been framed as cooperation hardened into expectation, then obligation. Boundaries were tested through small demands that carried unspoken consequences. When resistance appeared, it was met with reminders of sacrifice, of family, of what would be lost by saying no. The trust, once a symbol of shared legacy, became a lever. Control disguised itself as responsibility, and pressure wore the mask of concern. It was in that transformation that the clause found its moment. The clause was written for exactly this scenario, though no one wanted to admit it. It was designed to activate when consent was compromised, when decisions were extracted rather than offered freely. Its language was precise, unemotional, and firm. Upon evidence of undue influence, authority would pause. Assets would be protected. Decision-making power would temporarily shift away from those exerting control. It did not accuse. It did not dramatize. It simply functioned. When it was finally invoked, disbelief filled the room. The same people who had dismissed the clause as symbolic reacted as though a betrayal had occurred. Voices rose, not in argument but in shock, as if rules were being broken rather than enforced. They had assumed permanence. They had assumed compliance. They had assumed that silence meant agreement. What they had never expected was accountability embedded in ink. The activation of the clause did not explode the trust. It stabilized it. Processes resumed under scrutiny. Documents were reviewed without bias. Decisions slowed, then clarified. What had been blurred by authority sharpened under structure. For the first time, the trust behaved as it was always intended to behave, not as a tool of dominance, but as a shield against it. The clause did not take sides. It removed leverage. What made the moment so jarring was not the power of the clause itself, but the fact that it worked. There was no loophole to exploit, no relationship strong enough to override it. The law did not bend to emotion, history, or hierarchy. It responded only to evidence and procedure. Those who had relied on control suddenly found themselves constrained by the very system they believed they owned. In the end, the clause did not punish anyone. It revealed them. It exposed assumptions, highlighted behavior, and restored balance without raising its voice. It reminded everyone involved that trusts are not built on goodwill alone, but on foresight. The clause they never expected to activate had always been waiting, patient and unyielding, not as a threat, but as a promise that control would never be absolute. Authority often feels unbreakable when it is reinforced by habit rather than challenge. Over time, repeated obedience can make power appear natural, even deserved, until it becomes difficult to separate leadership from entitlement. In that space, authority no longer relies on fairness or consent, but on the expectation that it will not be questioned. For years, that expectation held. Decisions were accepted, instructions followed, and objections quietly swallowed in the name of order. The structure seemed solid, not because it was just, but because no one tested it. The collapse began not with confrontation, but with reading. Written law has a unique ability to sit patiently while being ignored, only to assert itself with precision when finally invoked. Unlike authority, it does not raise its voice or demand loyalty. It waits. When the words were examined closely, they revealed limits that had always existed but had been conveniently forgotten. The authority that once filled every room suddenly found itself outlined, defined, and constrained by sentences it could not rewrite. Those who had ruled through influence and pressure were unprepared for how small their power looked on paper. What had felt absolute in practice was conditional in law. Permissions they assumed were permanent were, in fact, temporary. Rights they claimed were never granted. The written words stripped away ambiguity, replacing personal interpretation with fixed meaning. Authority that thrived in gray areas began to weaken under clarity. Resistance followed quickly, but it lacked direction. Arguments appealed to history, sacrifice, and intention, yet none of those carried weight against signed documents. The law did not care who had spoken the loudest or longest. It recognized only what had been agreed to, recorded, and preserved. In that moment, authority lost its greatest weapon. the ability to redefine reality through repetition. The narrative shifted from who should decide to who was legally permitted to do so. As procedures were enforced, the imbalance became undeniable. Actions once taken without explanation now required justification. Decisions once made privately were subject to review. Oversight replaced assumption. The same figures who had enforced compliance were now required to comply themselves. Bound by processes they had dismissed as technicalities, their authority did not vanish in a dramatic fall. It eroded steadily, weakened by every clause they could not bypass. What made the collapse so profound was the realization that the law had never changed. It was the same text it had always been, quietly governing from the background. Authority had not been overthrown. It had been corrected. The power imbalance had existed only because the written limits were ignored, not because they were absent. Once activated, the law did exactly what it was designed to do: restore proportion. For those who had lived under unchecked authority, the shift felt disorienting but freeing. The presence of written law created space to breathe, to speak without fear of retaliation. It introduced predictability where uncertainty had reigned. Boundaries became visible, and with visibility came safety. The collapse of authority was not chaos. It was order asserting itself after a long silence. In the end, the written law did not destroy leadership. It redefined it. Authority that could not survive within its boundaries was never legitimate to begin with. What remained was not control, but structure, steady and impartial. The moment authority collapsed under written law was not a failure of the system, but its quiet success, proving that power lasts only as long as it respects the words that bind it. Walking away is often misunderstood as surrender, as though leaving a conflict means losing it. In reality, walking away can be the clearest expression of strength, especially when the goal was never to win, but to understand. Clarity does not arrive with applause or validation. It arrives quietly, often after the noise has faded, when the mind finally has space to separate truth from obligation. That clarity makes victory irrelevant. For a long time, staying felt necessary. Presence was mistaken for responsibility, endurance for loyalty. Each compromise was justified as temporary, each discomfort reframed as the price of keeping peace. Over time, the line between patience and self-erasure blurred. What was given was no longer appreciated, only expected. In that environment, winning would have meant dominating, proving a point, or forcing acknowledgement. None of those outcomes promised relief. They only offered continuation. The decision to walk away did not come from anger, but from exhaustion with confusion. Questions that had once been whispered grew louder, demanding answers that were never provided. Patterns repeated themselves with slight variations, always ending in the same imbalance. Clarity emerged not through confrontation, but through observation. When behavior no longer required interpretation, the truth became unavoidable. Staying would not change it. Walking away meant releasing the need to be understood by those invested in misunderstanding. It meant accepting that explanation would not heal what denial protected. The absence of closure, once feared, became a form of freedom. Without the constant pull to justify or defend, energy returned, perspective widened, the fog lifted, revealing how much had been normalized that should never have been tolerated. There was no dramatic exit, no final speech, no score kept. Walking away was deliberate and calm, guided by an internal alignment that no longer wavered. Boundaries replaced arguments. Distance replaced negotiation. The clarity that followed was not triumphant, but steady. It did not demand recognition. It simply existed, solid and unshakable. What remained after walking away was not bitterness, but understanding. The situation was seen for what it was, not what it had been promised to become. That understanding removed the illusion of loss. Nothing of value had been abandoned. What was left behind was confusion, pressure, and the constant effort of pretending something could be fixed through endurance alone. Victory would have required someone else to lose. Clarity required only honesty. In choosing clarity, the need to measure outcomes against others disappeared. Progress was internal, marked by peace rather than proof. The absence of conflict did not signal weakness, but completion. The lesson had been learned, the boundary drawn, the chapter closed. Walking away with clarity changed the meaning of success. It was no longer about being right, acknowledged, or justified. It was about alignment, self-respect, and the quiet confidence that comes from acting in truth. In that space, victory felt unnecessary. Clarity was enough, and it stayed long after everything else had been left behind.